Greetings here from Pintpot. Welcome to my latest edition of Climbing the Curve, the series intended to make you the hunter rather than the hunted a little faster. Now today I'm going to be looking at upgrading the Heavy Assault. Now whilst upgrading the Heavy Assault class abilities can ultimately become very expensive, at the early part of the game it is actually very cheap. And this is because, unlike some other classes such as the Medic and the Light Assault, upgrading the core default ability of the Heavy Assault doesn't make a dramatic difference. With no upgrades it takes 60 seconds to fully recharge, and fully upgraded it takes 45 seconds. Whilst this is useful, it is not a game changer like, say, the upgrades on the Medic tool. Now the consequence of this is that in the early game it frees up plenty of certs to invest in its tertiary weapon, the rocket launcher, and in its class specific grenades. However, before I consider these options, I'm going to take a quick look at its ability slot where it houses the shield. Now there are three varieties of shield which can be fitted in this slot. The default shield is a Nanite mesh generator. When activated it absorbs damage. It also reduces movement speed to 75%. As you receive damage it depletes the energy of the shield. At max energy it absorbs about 600 damage, therefore at half energy it absorbs about 300 damage. Now one of the alternatives, the adrenaline shield, works pretty much the same way. The difference being it recovers more energy when you kill other players rather than quicker over time. Now I would not consider investing in this at all in the early game because A, it's very expensive, and B, it relies on the player being able to consistently kill other players to be of much use. Neither of these properties are appropriate for beginner players. The other alternative is the resist shield. This absorbs 45% of damage incoming. Therefore, to properly benefit from this ability, you have to have it switched on before you start receiving damage. In other words, you have to have good anticipation of which situations you're going to receive damage in. Therefore, I would not recommend this to newer players. It is something worth coming back to a little later in the game. Therefore, in the early game, I would just be looking to invest 31 certs in a Nanite mesh generator. This modest investment will reduce your recovery time from 60 seconds to 54. Now the suit slot upgrades that best work with a Nanite mesh generator are Flak armor and Nanoweave armor. This is because as both abilities reduce the percentage of incoming damage, this resistance buff also applies to the additional effective health you get from your shield as well as your base health and shields. Now usually I'd only recommend investing in one or other of these abilities. However, for the Heavy Assault I recommend investing in both. The reason is that as the Heavy Assault you're designed to fight both infantry and vehicle. Against infantry you want to be using Nanoweave armor, but against vehicles you want to be using Flak armor. The reason being that many vehicles' weapons have extremely heavy explosive damage attached to them. Particularly when fighting planes, having Flak armor greatly increases your survivability. Now let's consider the rocket launcher. Ignoring Empire specific rocket launchers, there's effectively two varieties of rocket launcher, dumbfire and lock-on. Now the rule of thumb characteristics of both are these. Dumbfire rockets hit very hard, but they have very low velocity and therefore only effective at short range. Lock-on rockets are effective at much longer distances because of their lock-on capability, but do not hit quite as hard. The default starting rocket is a dumbfire rocket. There are two varieties of dumbfire, the default and the decimator. Now the decimator hits harder but is slower than the default. However, as it costs 1,000 certs to unlock, I'm going to ignore it for now. With the lock-on rockets, you have a ground-to-air lock-on, the ground-to-ground lock-on, and the Annihilator, which does both. Now the Annihilator costs 1,000 certs to unlock, which is too expensive for beginners, so I'm going to ignore that as well. There are also the Empire specific rockets, which each have their own characteristics, but as they all cost 1,000 certs to unlock, I'm going to ignore them for now. So the two options you should be considering to unlock are the ground-to-air and the ground-to-ground. My personal recommendation is to unlock the ground-to-air missile first. The reason for this is that it is incredibly hard to hit aircraft with a dumbfire missile. They have to be literally face-hugging you or hovering just above to have a viable chance of hitting them. The velocity of the rockets is so slow that it's very easy for planes to dodge them. Therefore, dumbfire rockets are not a credible deterrent against aircraft. Therefore, by investing in the ground-to-air lock-on missile, you become a credible AA deterrent. Now the trade-off for lock-on missiles versus dumbfire missiles is that lock-on missiles do not hit quite as hard. As you can see from the numbers above, it effectively takes one more hit on a tank to destroy them than it would with the default dumbfire. This effect is much more exaggerated with planes, where it takes 3 hits from a lock-on to destroy an ESF rather than 1 from a dumbfire. And this is to balance out how much easier it is to hit a target with a lock-on than it is with a dumbfire. Now there is one exception to this, and that is the Sunderer. It actually only takes 5 shots with the lock-on rather than 6 with a dumbfire to destroy a Sunderer. This makes no sense to me whatsoever, and I can only consider it a mistake by the devs in the resistance tables. There is no justification for this from a balance perspective, but that's the way it is. Now later on in the game, when you have a few more certs to spare, then I'd recommend picking up the ground-to-ground missile as well. In this way you can switch between the two according to what the threat is that you're facing. Now for the utility slot, I would recommend investing in Medikit to start off with, and later on when you have enough certs, in C4. This is because, as ever, C4 is an expensive investment, and given the fact you have the rocket launcher, you have anti-tank capabilities regardless. Now the final thing to consider is the grenade slot. For most classes I wouldn't recommend unlocking grenades in the early stage, but in my opinion the heavy assault grenades are the best in the game, and therefore I believe they are worth the investment. There are 2 varieties, the anti-vehicle grenade and the concussion grenade. Now the real purpose of the anti-vehicle grenade is to destroy maxes. Against vehicles you're much better off using your rocket. However, against a max, without flak armour, whilst the basic frag grenade does about 20% damage, the anti-vehicle grenade does 75% damage. Therefore it's very good for clearing rooms defended by maxes. Now the other grenade heavy assaults can unlock, and my personal favourite, is the concussion grenade. When hit with one of these, it both impairs your sight and makes it very difficult to rotate and move. Therefore it is absolutely brilliant for clearing rooms and other strong points. I would highly recommend this grenade, and it's particularly good for players who like to play aggressively. So in conclusion, by only needing to invest a few certs in your default shield ability, this frees up plenty of certs to invest in their other key abilities, the rocket launcher and their grenades. Therefore it's possible to get a great deal of functionality out of the heavy assault very early in the game. Now my next episode I'm going to be looking at the various anti-aircraft options in the game. If you found this episode interesting or useful, please feel free to thumbs up, thumbs down, comment or subscribe as appropriate. In the meantime, have a good one, happy hunting, and Pintpot out.